Okay, well, it's my pleasure to welcome our next presenter. Jericho Cummings is the ASMSU um, student director of diversity and inclusion here at Montana State University in Bozeman, and also was kind enough to provide our land acknowledgement on day one. Jericho, we're lucky to have you back for another session. Thank you so much. Uh, Go ahead and take it away. And I think you will have to load your slide again. So go ahead and load your PowerPoint. We'll give you a second to do that. And there it is.
Awesome. Sweet. Thank you for having me back. It's a pleasure to be here and to present on this bit of kind of informal research that has been in the works for a couple of years. Before we begin, I would kind of just like to situate the knowledge. As I said in the land acknowledgement, for those of you who weren't here, Bozeman specifically has a very rich and layered history as it applies to the many various tribes who have once called this place home. And I just kind of want to say that, or I want to acknowledge the fact that this information has been given to me from family, friends, colleagues, professors, and then as well as doing my own research within my time as a Native American Studies minor student. So a lot of this information has largely been in part of, or it's been a work in progress that I can't say I take full credit for, but other folks have been on this journey with me, and I'm very thankful for that. And at one point in time, my tribe, the Cheyenne River Sioux people, called Bozeman home, or had been up in this region doing various things with the other tribes that also called this place home or served as a meeting point. So that's kind of what brought me here. And throughout my time in academia, I have became much more aware of various aspects of traditional ways of knowing and being that have kind of gone by the wayside as a product of colonization. So that's what I'm here to share with you all today. Earlier this year, the Pine Ridge Reservation was one of the first in the nation to create a hate crime law protecting LGBTQ plus and Two-Spirit citizens. And with that, I am not as formally affiliated with the Oglala Sioux tribe, but we're all a part of the Great Sioux Nation in South Dakota, and my dad actually participated in ceremony on the Pine Ridge Reservation, so that's kind of where most of my experience with ceremony and my heritage, that's where it was very formative. So it's a very complex relationship that I have to not only the Pine Ridge Reservation, but also this topic in general. I was born and raised in South Dakota before coming to school here in Montana. So I'm very fortunate to have seen not only tribes in my home state, but also one that I have such a close connection to make immense change for their LGBTQ plus and Two-Spirit citizens. And with that being said, I'll transition into some of the history as it applies to formulating this hate crime law. So before colonization, various tribes throughout the North American continent embraced what we call in the literature traditional gender systems, where they operated on a multiple gender identity system that exists outside the male-female binary that we know today. And in that sense, there were definitely male identifying, female identifying, and then some sort of combination of the two. In my research, I have found that has kind of primarily been a third gender identity, which I'll get into a little bit more in the presentation. But I've seen from 3 gender identities all the way up to 7, and it kind of just depends on the tribe and how complex and even just like how accepted they were of various gender identities. So with that being said, not every tribe embraced this gender variance, gender diversity. So I want to make that clear that not every tribe opted into the system. Some very much so upheld the male-female binary. And one of the first anthropologists that did research on gender diversity amongst various tribes basically has said that they all viewed gender diversity in terms of the sexual division of labor that factors into their subsistence patterns and social relations. And that came from Will Roscoe's The Gay American Indian Anthology, I believe. So with that, when the first explorers and settlers came to Turtle Island, they looked at the gender variant systems very poorly and viewed them as being deviant and hedonistic without necessarily understanding that the folks who embraced this gender variant way of life or embraced the third gender identity also factored into this division of labor, oftentimes participated in the greater subsistence patterns that factored into the overall success and just general well-being of the tribal community. And with that, there's been a lot of talk about returning to various aspects of traditional indigenous ways of knowing and being, some of which are indigenous research methodologies. So recognizing and validating oral history and storytelling as valid forms of research and support. And then also traditional ecological knowledge, which kind of applies more to caring for the land, farming, that kind of thing. In my 3-4 years as an NAS minor student, a lot of the literature that I tended to focus most of my fieldwork on was focusing on this traditional gender systems and how sexuality also factored into that. So there's a lot of resurgence going on in the field of literature, and I would say even in activism. And I'll kind of get into that a little bit later with some authors that you all could look into to try and educate yourselves. One other thing that I would like to kind of differentiate before moving forward is that these tribes that did embrace 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th gender identities, those individuals oftentimes did not initiate in same-sex romantic relationships or sexual relationships. Those what we would kind of view as sexuality and sexual identity today was very separate from gender. So with that, individuals who embrace the gender variant system could also engage in same-sex relationships, as well as heterosexual relationships and sexual interactions, I guess, without it necessarily being viewed the same way that we view it today. So it was all very much so based on gender, what you bring to the community and how the community prospers, and who you engaged in romantic and sexual interactions and relationships with was kind of viewed as secondary. One of the most prominent aspects of our history that kind of speaks volumes to the resurgence efforts of traditional gender systems and the experiences of LGBTQ plus identifying Indigenous populations comes from the boarding school era. The boarding schools were used as a mechanism to enforce European standards of conduct and conformity onto Indigenous people. There's the prominent like Carlisle boarding school in Pennsylvania that has kind of like led most of the atrocities, such as like cutting hair, stripping of traditional clothing, prohibiting cultural practices and speaking language, as well as other various forms of assault. I don't want to say that all of the boarding schools opted into that similar like field of thought or acts. Like some of them were actually had well structured, like one here in the States, Fort Shaw boarding school. And there's an amazing PBS special about them, about this group of girls playing basketball. So it kind of shows a good contrasting experience. But because of the relationship with the Indigenous population from the first settlers and colonizers, and the Eurocentric views that they had of the Indigenous populations, they used the boarding schools as well as like various like religious faiths, primarily Christianity, to champion their efforts for conformity of the Indigenous population. So this was a very problematic, I think a very problematic point in history for gender diversity and LGBTQ plus identifying Indigenous folk, because as you can see, like in both of these photos, their identities were stripped away, and this is very much like an exterior perspective. And one thing that I always think about is how you can't necessarily assume one's gender identity or sexual identity based on the way that they interact with the world from an exterior perspective. So I don't want to make any assumptions about these individuals in the photographs, but we might not know whether they embraced the third gender outside of the gender binary. And that is very problematic in the sense that when these individuals would get to the boarding school, if they were of the third, fourth, fifth gender identity in their tribe, everything that they knew about themselves and how they were supposed to carry themselves in their tribal community was stripped of them, and they were forced into these very foreign ideologies, ways of being, as well as forms of presentation that I think have a lot of lasting impacts in our communities today, and also factors into a lot of the resurgence efforts. So a lot of the authors that I have chosen to primarily focus on throughout my undergrad experience are trying to shed light and highlight these experiences, as well as the trajectory where LGBTQ plus and Two-Spirit folk are going, specifically in the 21st century, and trying to move beyond these Western European standards of beauty, conduct, and thought even. So I've been talking a lot about resurgence, and I've said that literature has been primarily the format I've engaged with, or the platform that I've engaged with. A lot of those have consisted of like autobiographies, novels, and poetry. A few of my favorite, I guess, like poets would be Billy Ray Belcourt and then Christos. And one of my favorite like coming of age, like also like slight autobiographies, is Joshua Whitehead's Johnny Appleseed. That is kind of the one book that really shaped the ways in which I think about the intersectionality of indigeneity, gender, and sex and sexual orientation or sexual identity. with that being said, I opened this presentation up talking about one of the first anthropologists to do research on this subject matter. There has also been a, I guess, path forged for Indigenous queer studies, which is something that or the field that I would say that I'm like primarily interested in. I wouldn't say that it's like a quote unquote like termed academic field. It kind of tends to fall a bit under like more feminist theory, queer theory, and even like critical race theory and things of that nature. So outside of like literature, there have been a lot of conferences and gatherings for queer. I'm gonna probably from this point on, instead of just saying the whole LGBTQ plus acronym, I'll refer to it as queer, but I would also like to acknowledge that not all individuals who identify with the acronym feel comfortable using the term queer. But there have been several international Two-Spirit gatherings, and then several Two-Spirit and HIV focused conferences. And one of the most surprising events that I had found was just this past year at World Pride in New York. This is where one of the conferences was had. And I believe it was just in February, the Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirits group held their 9th annual Two-Spirit powwow. And I think I even just found out recently, I believe it was like Two-Spirit Awareness Month week at some point in March, and that there's also a Two-Spirit powwow going on in Arizona, which I think is amazing. And like I said, there are several things focused on academia and academic disciplines. And to touch on that, Quolie Driscoll, as well as several other contributors, have championed the efforts of Indigenous queer studies as like a discipline or like a field of thought. And Indigenous queer studies is the title of one of their anthologies, as well as, I want to say, Sovereign Erotics is the other one. And those two are very contrasting experiences. One is like a very academic focused kind of anthology, and the other one focuses a little bit more on various I don't know how to describe it, like poetry, short story, autobiographies, things of that nature. So I suggest if you're interested in this topic material, look into those authors as well. And I can throw those in the chat later on too, if anyone would like. So I've been talking a lot about like gender diversity, gender variance, and Two-Spirit. I'm not sure if anyone knows what it means to be Two-Spirit, but Two-Spirit is a term that was coined very recently at one of these like greater conferences where a lot of Indigenous and queer identifying individuals wanted to create a term in which they could distance themselves from the white Western queer experience. And this video that I will show here in a second just like kind of goes very deeply into the history, what it means to identify as Two-Spirit, and kind of just the process in which this term came to be. So I'm going to hopefully get this up and running for y'all. And I apologize for all of my tabs. It's finals week.
I feel like I was just constantly cleaning up this air. Then I got my paws on the Super Sweeper. It's a game changer. These heavy-duty dry cloths pick up a crazy amount of hair. This is all you. We stopped cleaning and started sweeping.
I mean, this.
Sorry, 1 second.
Jericho, it sounded like the audio was coming through, so.
Okay, cool. Okay, let me know. Can y'all see this YouTube video?
Yep. It's
Okay,
not
sweet.
playing yet. We do see it on the screen if you... There it is. It's maximized.
Awesome. All right.
Go
Here we
ahead and
go.
press play.
Okay.
Let me just Two-Spirit one more time. Though the label has only been used since the 90s, the concept of the Two-Spirit is something Indigenous groups have identified with for centuries. But what does Two-Spirit actually mean, and where does it come from? So what is Two-Spirit? It's an umbrella term that bridges Indigenous and Western understandings of gender and sexuality. You may recognize it as the two that sometimes appears at the end of LGBTQ2. There are many definitions and understandings of Two-Spirit, and each is nation-specific. The term was intentionally introduced by Native people with the goal of finding common ground and helping educate about traditional teachings in a contemporary context. The Two-Spirit Society of Denver offers the following definition. Two-Spirit refers to another gender role believed to be common among most, if not all, First Peoples of Turtle Island, North America, one that had a proper and accepted place within Native societies. This acceptance was rooted in the spiritual teachings that say all life is sacred. So how did the term Two-Spirit first come about? In 1990, in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, at the 3rd Annual Native American Gay and Lesbian Gathering, the term Two-Spirit was proposed and affirmed by consensus. The word was a potential solution to what Native scholars and activists called the problem of naming, or making the many different sexual and gender identities that fall under the Two-Spirit umbrella legible across Native and non-Native cultures alike. For example, to illustrate the diversity of meanings that Two-Spirit contains, consider the following. In Lakota, the word winkte means to be as a woman and refers to two-souled Lakota people who transgress boundaries of gender from what may be considered male to female. In Dene, nadlehe means those who transform and refers to one of 4 separate genders, masculine-feminine, masculine-masculine, feminine-masculine, and feminine-feminine. Each gender has its own word in the Dene language. And those are just 2 nation-specific examples. There are so many more. Each nation's understanding of gender and sexual diversity is different and grounded in specific spiritual beliefs. Although all nations don't have a concept of Two-Spirit people, across those Indigenous nations that do, Two-Spirit people were historically held in high regard and often considered sacred or divine, holding important positions like matchmakers, medicine people, or warriors on the front lines of battle. Many Two-Spirit people perform roles traditionally assigned to both men and women. Witwa, a famous Two-Spirit of the Zuni or Ihamana, was known to take part in masculine tribal matters and feminine tribal matters, and was even sent as an official Zuni delegate to Washington, D.C. Part of the reason Two-Spirit was adopted at the 1990 conference was because much of the written record on the indigenous nations of North America begins with European contact. For instance, the writings of Jesuit priests from the 1600s contain references to berdaches, which means kept boy in French, to refer to those who embodied both male and female genders. These writings often focus negatively on perceived cross-dressing among the Anishinaabe. The term is not only inaccurate in that it projects a European understanding of gender, but is widely considered pejorative by natives. Two-Spirit was an attempt at self-determination across linguistic barriers, because the existing language, foreign and imposed violently on the indigenous peoples of North America, was both offensive and deeply colonial in its gaze. European colonizers imposed homophobia, rigid binary gender roles, and misogyny under the guise of civilizing indigenous people through the Christian tradition in residential schools and beyond. As a result, indigenous people were robbed not only of their land, but of their spiritual traditions and way of life regarding Two-Spirit people. Many nations came to forbid and punish Two-Spirit unions and self-expression. As recently as 2004, Kathy Reynolds and Dawn McKinley, 2 Cherokee women in Tulsa, Oklahoma, attempted to marry under tribal law, setting off a convoluted legal battle with serious political and social implications. The 2 were thrust into the spotlight against their wishes and became instant public symbols of the battle for Two-Spirit rights under tribal law. The Cherokee tribe is the second largest in the US. Although they were granted the right to marry, the decision to issue them a marriage license was soon challenged and led to a tribal law declaring that a union was to be between a man and a woman. Eventually, in 2016, the law was overturned. By that time, a wider cultural shift had taken place, both outside of and within the Cherokee Nation. In recent years, many Native people are returning to their Two-Spirit traditions as a way to heal from the injustices the American colonial project has visited upon their ancestors and traditions. In 2011, the first known U.S. Two-Spirit powwow was organized by the Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirits. Since then, powwows honoring Two-Spirits have been held in Montana and Kansas. And in March of 2017, the largest powwow in the U.S., the Gathering of Nations, honored Two-Spirit people during its grand entry. Two-Spirit identity is resilient and precious. It has survived centuries of colonial violence and prejudice. These sacred ways of knowing live on amongst Native youth seeking to know more about themselves, elders who have kept their traditions alive in spite of the odds, and anyone in between. It should go without saying, but Two-Spirit is not a poetic way for non-Native LGBTQ people to express themselves. We're looking at you, Jason Mraz. It is, however, a sacred tradition among the first peoples of this land we call Turtle Island, that all of its inhabitants should know about and respect.
Great, that seemed to come through, Jericho, and I did post the link.
Okay, sweet. Okay. First off, are there any questions about anything so far that I've touched on?
I'll let you know if any comments come up.
Okay, cool. So there are a couple of things that I love about that video. Them is a amazing resource. They have like an email list you can subscribe to, and they just send out like the most amazing newsletters. And I would say like it's very intersectional, like touching on various aspects of like social class, race, ethnicity, obviously gender, sex, sexual orientation, and sexual identity. But there are two things in that video that I am not necessarily sure of. I have not heard of any Two-Spirit gatherings here in the state of Montana, so I can't speak to any of those events or really any sort of programming at this point. And I also don't understand the Jason Mraz reference either, so I can't speak to that as well. But despite the length of this video, I think it is relatively short, but it covers a lot of amazing ground in it that I think like speaks volumes to what I probably could not do in this full allotted time space. But there are several things that I want to like touch on before we move forward. Is when the individual in the film talked about the Nodle or the Dine Two-Spirit terminology, like that is where some of the higher like 5, 6, 7 gender identities comes from. So just kind of a little food for thought in that realm. But as the individual said that from the 1600s, those effects have largely still lingered as a product of colonization and primarily like the boarding school era that has left our communities with a lot of homophobia and intolerance towards gender diversity and the queer experience, LGBTQ plus identities that kind of like transcends into where I'll be switching gears. So in the film, the individual talked about a Two-Spirit couple in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who wanted to get married, and that basically that created a lot of political and social barriers, issues, and problems. And so I wanted to touch on that a little bit, and this presentation like primarily came from my federal Indian law and policy class that I took last semester to finish out my minor. So for those of you who don't know, Congress has plenary power over Indian affairs, which means that Congress basically gets to make the decisions, or the choices that Congress makes affects tribes, reservations, and their government systems. So when the US Supreme Court struck down the same-sex marriage bans in all 50 states, that didn't apply to the reservations because Congress did not pass any sort of legislation saying that this was extended to tribal governments. So, as the film or the clip said, some tribes created, I can't think of the right word off the top of my head right now, legislation we'll go with that stated that marriage was a union between a man and a woman. Because it was a Supreme Court ruling and decision, that is how tribes were able to create their own laws and frameworks as it applies to same-sex marriage. With that being said, various tribes and tribal governments kind of shied away from that man and a woman kind of union and made it much more inclusive, and also with the opposite, making it very limiting. So the experiences are very stratified, and the opinions and viewpoints amongst tribal citizens and voting members also differ, which factor into these laws and frameworks that the tribal governments get to create and enact on their reservations and for their people. So with that being said, this brings me to the whole point of South Dakota, the state of South Dakota, and the Pine Ridge Reservation and the Oglala Sioux people. There are 9 reservations throughout the state, and on July 8th, sorry, let me move this, of 2019, the Oglala Sioux tribe became the first in the state to pass a same-sex marriage law. That was because Muffy and Philippa, 2 individuals who grew up on the Pine Ridge Reservation, wanted to get married in their home community in 2015 when the ban on same-sex marriage was lifted. They went to their tribal leaders in hopes to get, their governmental leaders to get the marriage license signed. And in that moment found out that their tribe did not recognize same-sex marriage and kind of upheld that union being between a man and a woman. Unfortunately, the 2 had to get married outside of their tribal community, which I think has a lot of other social repercussions that I will touch on a little bit later. But so this couple basically went around the state to all the various reservations, talking to tribal leaders to get support for a same-sex marriage law to be passed. And they talked with their tribal leaders about that specifically. And it wasn't necessarily met with a lot of support, specifically by other individuals in their community, because everyone has to vote in favor for this. But after championing and getting this written into law, the couple wanted to further their activist efforts and create a hate crime law protecting the LGBTQ plus citizens of the Pine Ridge Reservation because of experiences with harassment and discrimination that they had faced from their fellow tribal members and citizens. And basically the hate crime law was modeled after Matthew Shepard and James Baird Jr. Hate Crimes Protection Act of 2009. But they were met with several roadblocks, just like they were trying to get the same-sex marriage law passed, and primarily from citizens of their tribe and of their reservation. Sorry. So with that, when they went around to the various tribal leaders in the state, trying to gain support for this, there had to be a vote, basically, on opting into this hate crime law. And in the process, a lot of citizens, specifically on the Pine Ridge Reservation, wanted to rule back the same-sex marriage law and basically do away with the progress of the hate crime law as well as the same-sex marriage law. And ultimately, that decision was left up to the tribal leader to vote in favor of. And you all can do a little bit of research. I can't remember if it's Indian Country Today or another sort of news article format. But basically, there was an exchange from a citizen of the tribe that lived on the reservation as well, who basically had said that just like a lot of very horrific and demeaning things, and basically cited the Bible and that the tribe would get their land taken away if this law were to pass, which is very controversial. And I don't want to make it sound like I'm bashing Christianity. Because the tribal leader had actually appreciated the woman's knowledge and insight of the Christian faith and of the Bible. But his decision rested on saying that we have been Lakota since time immemorial and before the Bible was brought to our people. And I want to uphold our tradition. So going back to the traditional gender systems and the ways in which individuals would engage in same-sex romantic or sexual unions, interactions, relationships, things of that nature, and viewed this hate crime law as a way to champion like their self-determination, their sovereignty, as well as basically saying to the youth like that if you identify as such, like you have a valued place in our community and we want to continuously protect you. And also just with like adults as well. But the final resting decision of the tribal leader specifically, he references protecting youth. So in the hate crime law, harassment, assault, and discrimination are listed as instances where they can seek out protection. And protection kind of looks like those folks enacting assault, harassment, or discrimination will either serve a year in jail time, a fine, or have to pay restitution. And I haven't seen anything about like how successful this system has been because the law was passed very early on in September, and there hasn't been much talk about it since. What I do know is that this is very important in terms of sovereignty, self-determination, as well as representation of Indigenous queer bodies and the Indigenous queer experience, because a lot of times folks forget that this is a part of our history that has been silenced and kind of like swept under the rug for specific reasons. And I view those being like racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, X, Y, and Z. But not only creating this law, but also passing the same-sex marriage law specifically on this reservation is important because there is a high number or high rate of suicide amongst Indigenous communities and then also on this reservation. And I don't want to say that all of them are because of the lack of support of being someone of the LGBTQ plus like identity grouping, but there is a lot of discourse and thought, specifically like in queer spaces, that you have to leave like your small rural like hometown and go to a city and find acceptance. And I think that creating this hate crime law, as well as recognizing same-sex unions, will hopefully decrease that bit of specifically like the youth wanting to leave their home environments, their home communities, in search of a more inclusive environment. My hope is that it not only will help decrease like suicide rates, as well as like bullying and harassment, homophobia, transphobia, the whole gamut, but that it will also help serve and support like tribal government and legal services and systems that apply not only to the Pine Ridge Reservation, but the rest of the state of South Dakota and across Turtle Island. Like I think I heard last that there was one other tribe that was going to opt into a similar hate crime law, and that wouldn't have been, I think that work wouldn't have been done if Muffy and Philippa hadn't been so determined and dedicated to fight for support, recognition, as well as what's the word that I'm looking for? Protection. And I think that's it. I want to open it up to questions for y'all that might have some.
Great, and I'll monitor those, Jericho, while our audience might be typing those in. And again, just to let you know, a few links were posted to attendees about some resources on PBS. Independent Lens apparently has a film on Two-Spirits.
Sweet.
Another link from IndianCountryToday.com about the hate crime law. So thanks for posting those comments. So we have a few minutes before the top of the hour. If there are any questions or comments for Jericho, please type those in. Another set of links just came in on the Lakota People's Law Project YouTube video, and a link from them.us about Two-Spirit as well. So thank you for sharing all those.
And I just sent some of the authors. Oh wait, I sent that privately.
I can read those out while you're doing that again if you like. Yeah, you sent that to me. If you want to send that to all the attendees or all the participants, Billy Ray Belcourt, Christos, hopefully
Yep.
pronounce that right, and Koli Drizkill, authors, academics, poets. So hopefully I got those names close.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, we do have a few minutes if anyone has questions or comments for Jericho. Jericho, maybe in the meantime, do you want to tell us a little bit more about your plans? You'll be graduating, and what are the next steps for you?
Yeah, so that also circles back to how I said that I'm not sure like what kind of support exists here in the state for LGBTQ plus and Two-Spirit identifying individuals. But like Paul said, I'm graduating this semester, and I was just offered, I was accepted into the AmeriCorps Vistas program, so I will be doing a year of national service starting in July. And my field placement site is with the Montana Racial Equity Project, and I'm very stoked to have that be my placement site because they recently got a Pride Foundation grant to do a needs assessment throughout the state for queer and trans youth of color to find out what kind of like support, resources, services, programs that they would like to see and like to have either in their communities or I think even because of COVID, like ways to connect virtually if they might be in a very rural kind of community where it might take them a while to get to, say, like Bozeman or Billings or even Missoula and any other more larger hubs, I guess. Like I said, I'm from South Dakota, so I haven't like ventured much around the state throughout my time here, other than kind of going to the larger major portions of the state. But I'm very excited to start this work and to kind of see more of the state and the amazing like programs that are going on, specifically in Indian country, but also in terms of combating racism, seeing how folks are actively being anti-racist in their communities, and to just get a lot more experience around community organizing, and then hopefully grad school after that.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. A few comments have come up. A number of people saying, congrats on your AmeriCorps position. Alum here, Anna says. Thank you, Jericho, for sharing about the intersectionality and of the isms. Another comment, this was so awesome. Thank you so much, Jericho. Another comment, welcome to AmeriCorps, fellow AmeriCorps member here. That's Lance, he just said that. Great information about the history of this. Thank you. Thanks for that comment. And then a question. Do hope, are you seeing any other state or nations doing the same thing along the lines of the law?
Yeah, so it's been a while since I've done like revisited the efforts of other like states doing this. Um, and don't quote me on this, but I feel like I heard that it was a tribe here in Montana that was going to kind of model the hate crime law. But other than that, it was either, I want to say it was like a state that starts with an M or has a very large indigenous population already. Actually, with that being said, I think the Navajo reservation has been one of the most prominent places in North America specifically, who has a lot of online resources and talks and programs focusing on Two-Spirit experiences. So yeah, I wish I knew of the tribe that was going to mimic the hate crime law off the top of my head, but I don't right now. And then there is a website for a lot of this Two-Spirit stuff going on the Navajo reservation. I'm sure with a couple Google searches you could find it. And then I think there's a lot more informal social support going on in healthcare communities because of like the not only the relevance of sexually transmitted infections and diseases for all people, but also just the barriers that LGBTQ plus identifying people may struggle accessing. So like Indian Health Services, and I can only remember the acronym. It's NAIHP, I believe, like .org. They have a whole like Two-Spirit healthcare service page that is like comprised of services as well as like a bunch of like artwork and various like sorts of programming. So I wouldn't say that there's a lot more legal and governmental action being taken, but I think that there is a lot of social support and activist work being done in these various different communities that I hope will in turn transfer on to more legislation and laws, governmental work, that kind of stuff.
Great. And I do see someone else just posted, can you share your email in the chat, please?
Yeah.
If you don't mind sharing that information, and you can
Not at all.
send that to all participants.
Yep, I have that on.
Awesome, great. Um, Wonderful. Well, we just have a couple more minutes here before the top of the hour. Any closing comments from you, Jericho, that you'd like to leave us with?
I think that there are a lot of prominent figures, like Weewa was mentioned in that clip earlier. There's finds them and kills them is a Crow individual who's believed to embrace gender variance, like the third gender identity, basically. So there's a lot of rich history throughout Indigenous studies, Native American studies, about folks who would quote unquote like embrace a lot of these things that I had just spent this like hour talking about, that I think don't get a lot of they don't really enter the spotlight. And same with a lot of these authors. Like Johnny Appleseed is a very explicit, erotic coming of age story. And I just want to say that, like, being given the space to learn about these figures and to read these books that might not necessarily like work into the rigid structure of like what my class syllabus was, I was able to come away with a lot more takeaways, knowledge, insight, as well as self-reflection about like what it means to me to be both Indigenous and queer in this day and age. So for those of you who are educators, I strongly suggest doing a bit of research and finding ways that you can incorporate not only like overarching Indigenous experiences, but some of these that have been silenced, and that there's a lot of resurgence and basically just like coming into the limelight and coming into the spotlight. And then the other thing I would say is just continue to learn about not only like LGBTQ plus experiences, but also like intersectional LGBTQ plus experiences, and yeah, diversify your knowledge base. That's really all that I can say.
Well, Jericho, thank you again for joining us. The great information that you provided, and we wish you all the best with your next chapter.
Thank you.
And thanks again for sharing the your contact information with everybody. So,
Yeah.
well, with that, we're going to transition to our next set of presenters. We're going to take a short break. I'll just remind you, please don't log off. You can just stay right online. We're going to, we're just going to pause here, and I'm going to just stop the recording now.